So the Ides of March 44 BCE, a group of senators corner the most powerful man in Rome. And just like that, history is fractured. I mean, we all know the story of Julius Caesar's assassination. It's one of those huge, defining moments. But what if it just didn't happen?
I mean, really think about it. What if Caesar actually listened to all those warnings, decided to skip the Senate that day and just lived? What would have happened? How would that one single decision completely change not just Rome, but everything? The entire history of the Western world? Well, that's what we're going to dive into. Let's step into that alternate timeline together.
Okay, so before we can really imagine the world that could have been, we've got to ground ourselves in the world that was. Let's take a quick look back at Caesar's final days in our own history. This is the exact moment where our two timelines split. All right, so after years of just brutal civil war, Caesar comes out on top. He's the undisputed master of Rome, he's beaten all his rivals, he's back in the capital, and then, in early 44 BCE, he accepts a title that pretty much seals his fate, dictator for life. That was our reality.
This quote from Thomas Hobbes, it just perfectly sums up what life was like in late Republican Rome. I mean, after decades of nonstop civil war, the Roman world was just in chaos. It was that state of nature he talks about, where life was, well, nasty, brutish, and short. And for a lot of regular people, the idea of one strong ruler probably sounded way better than just endless, bloody conflict. So you have the assassins, right? Guys like Brutus and Cassius. And in their minds, they were heroes, they were liberators. They truly believed that if they could just get rid of Caesar, they could hit rewind, restore the old republic, save it from tyranny. But, oh boy, did that plan backfire. Spectacularly. Yeah, instead of saving the republic, what they actually did was plunge Rome into almost 20 more years of bloodshed. And out of all that chaos, who rises to the top? Not a restored Senate. Nope. It's Caesar's heir, Octavian, who would become Augustus, the very first Roman emperor. Just think about that. The one action they took to stop an autocrat ended up creating the entire system for an emperor. Okay, so now let's flip the script. Let's say the assassination fails. The conspirators are caught, Caesar lives. What happens the very next day? Well, now we are officially entering that alternate timeline. The first thing you really have to get your head around is this title. See, a normal Roman dictator, they had absolute power, but only for a short, fixed amount of time to solve some big crisis. By accepting dictator in perpetuity, Caesar was basically saying, the crisis is permanent, and so am I. To the Senate, this was a massive red flag. It was basically him saying he was a king, which was their absolute worst nightmare. So, with his power totally secure, Caesar would have just unleashed his populist reforms. He was already a total hero to the common people because of these plans, giving out land, getting rid of debts, making provincial citizens. But you have to understand, these weren't just nice policies. For Caesar, they were weapons aimed directly at the power of the old aristocratic Senate. Caesar had one big political weakness, if you can call it that. He was forgiving. He pardoned tons of his old enemies, including some of the very same guys who later stabbed him. Now his successor, Augustus, he learned from that mistake. He didn't forgive anybody. He just used prescription lists to wipe out his opposition completely. So, in our new timeline, you gotta believe a surviving Caesar learns that lesson the hard way. He probably purges the Senate and gets rid of his enemies for good. All right, so with things on the home front finally locked down, Caesar would have turned his eyes to the horizon. And at the time of his death, he wasn't just thinking about politics. Oh no. He was planning one of the biggest military campaigns in all of Roman history. He was getting ready to march east. His targets? First, Dacia, a really powerful kingdom over in Eastern Europe, and then the big one, the Parthian Empire. See, avenging the humiliating, catastrophic defeat of his old rival Crassus in Parthia, that was personal. It was a top priority. And this is where Caesar would have made all the difference. Crassus was reckless, he was arrogant, and he led his armies straight into total annihilation. But Caesar? He was a master strategist, known for being patient and planning every little detail. There's almost no doubt he would have succeeded, pushing Rome's borders way, way deeper into the east. And guess who'd be right there with him on this campaign? His young heir, Octavian. So instead of becoming this ruthless politician forged in the fires of civil war, obsessed with avenging his adopted father, Octavian becomes Caesar's military apprentice. He learns command, he learns strategy right from the master himself. This completely changes his entire life, his whole path to power. And that leads us to maybe the biggest long-term consequence of all. If Caesar lives, if he establishes his new world order, and if Octavian's life goes down this totally different path, we are now looking at a Roman world without the Emperor Augustus. At least, not the one we know. See, Augustus was a political genius, mainly because he learned from Caesar's mistakes. He never called himself dictator. Instead, he did this brilliant thing where he hid his absolute power behind all the old republican traditions. He called himself the princeps, the first citizen. It was just a masterful piece of political theater, and it's what made his absolute rule acceptable to everyone. Caesar, though, he was way more direct, right? He might have ruled like a king, no doubt about it, but with that specific, clever system that Augustus created, the Principate, which was the very foundation of the Roman Empire for centuries, would that have ever even been invented? It's a really fascinating thing to think about. But hold on, there's one final twist in this story. Even if Caesar dodged the assassin's daggers, he might not have lived that much longer anyway. A lot of sources suggest his health was failing. He might have had epilepsy, he was known to have seizures, so his natural death, maybe just a few years later while on campaign, would have kicked off its own succession crisis. Just a very, very different one from the bloody civil war that we actually got. Okay, so let's zoom out now. I mean, way out, to the grand scale. We've already changed Roman politics, we've changed its military history, but the ripple effects from this one single event, one man surviving one day, those would cascade down through the centuries, totally reshaping civilization as we know it. Think about the Pax Romana, you know, those famous 200 years of Roman peace. That was an Augustan project. It was his settlement after all the civil wars that created the stability for the empire to really flourish. So if you take Augustus out of the equation, does that golden age of peace and prosperity even happen? Or is it replaced by something completely different? Just think of the chain reaction here. Step 1, Caesar creates a straight-up, no apologies autocracy. Step 2, the Senate becomes basically a rubber stamp, generations earlier than it did in our timeline. So now you have a fundamentally different political world, and maybe that changes the very conditions that allowed a new religion like Christianity to spread so far and so fast. A stronger, maybe even larger Roman Empire, led by a dynasty of Caesars, who knows? Maybe its fall is postponed or happens in a completely different way. So why does any of this matter to us today? Well, because the world we live in right now, our languages, our laws, our religions, even the borders on a map of Europe, all of it was built on the foundation of the Roman Empire that Augustus created. If you change that foundation, our entire world could look completely, totally unrecognizable. You know, when you really get down to it, exploring this kind of alternate timeline just shows you how incredibly fragile history is. It's not some fixed story written in stone. It's more like a delicate chain of cause and effect, where you remove one single link and everything that follows starts to shift. The world we live in today, with all of its triumphs and tragedies, it might only exist for one simple reason, because one man did not get to live another day. It's a powerful thought that all of history can turn on just a single moment.